Many years ago, when I was really a teenager, I used to go to the folk centre in Brisbane, as did many of you, I'm sure, who lived in Brisbane. And there I met a lanky fellow named Graham Marrow. He and I hit it off from day one. Graham would often refer to me as the little brother that he didn't have. And we had a number of things in common. Firstly was our love of similar music, our love of Martin guitars. Now, around about, I think, 1975, thereabouts, an album of Paul Simon's came out, a live album called Live Ryman. And on the cover, it had a photo of Paul Simon in a white suit, and he was carrying a Martin guitar, but it was not like any other Martin I'd ever seen at that stage. I did a bit of research and found out that it was called a D35S. The sound on that Paul Simon album was just stupendous of this guitar, and Graham and I both marvelled at it, and lo and behold, before I knew it, he had two of them that he'd got somehow sent out to him from the United States. Why he bought two, I don't know to this day. It was perhaps he thought, if one was a dud, he could on-sell it and end up with the other one for less than he'd paid for it. But anyway, they were both fantastic guitars, and he kept them for a number of years. He married for a second time to a New Zealand lady named Ray, and they moved to New Zealand, and Graham took his other D35S Martin with him. Now, in the years before that, he and I would often get together to play guitar at his house at Taringa, and then when he was staying in a cabin at somebody else's place at Toowong, he'd come down to my place. We'd sit around and countless hours of playing guitar, and I always loved to play his D35S Martins. Anyway, about 11 years ago, he was planning another trip back, and he was going to come and stay with us, with my wife and I, for at least part of that time. He was looking forward to catching up with my son Sam, who he hadn't seen in many years, and he had heard some of Sam's playing online by this stage and was looking forward to catching up with him. He told me in a phone call that he had just strung up his Martin guitar again after not having played it for several years, and he was enjoying that. Sadly, about 2 weeks after that phone call, he passed away, and that hit me as a great shock, because he'd been one of my best friends for so many years. I couldn't go to his funeral in New Zealand because I'd stupidly let my passport lapse at that stage, but I wrote a letter and sent it across for his son Taylor. And that letter, or email as it was, formed a part of his eulogy, which I'm really pleased with. So it meant that although I couldn't be there in person, I was there in spirit at his funeral. Anyway, fast forward about 9 or 10 years, and I'm browsing on Gumtree, as one does, and I come across a D35S Martin guitar for sale in Brisbane. So I tried to contact the guy that had it for sale, and unfortunately he didn't answer messages. My good friend Michael Fix and his wife were up at our place for dinner, for lunch one weekend, and I mentioned this guitar to him, and Michael had been looking for a good Martin, and being somewhat more proactive than me, and I must admit I wasn't seriously looking for another guitar, Michael got onto the guy and bought it. And lo and behold, it turned out that it was Graham's guitar, and I thought, well, it's the alternate guitar. It had a lot of problems. It had been sadly neglected for years and years, and and needed some serious work to get it to tune properly. For one thing, it had cracks through the bridge and it had a warped neck, and it looked like being quite an expensive process to bring it back to its former glory. This is one of the best guitars I'd ever heard in my life, if not the best, for certainly, well, it's hard to say what's the best, but certainly it's right up amongst the 2 or 3 best guitars I've ever heard. After owning it for some time, Michael decided it was going to be just too much trouble to bring it back, as I say, to its former glory. So he contacted me, knowing that it would mean something to me. I'd been kicking myself for not going and buying it myself, because it was Graham's old guitar. So I bought it off Michael. I really didn't need another guitar at the time, but because it had been Graham's guitar and I'd played it 40 years ago many times, I really wanted it, so I bought it. I took it to legendary luthier Jim Mills down in New South Wales, who did an absolutely wonderful job of bringing it back, straightening the neck, making a new bridge for it that looks like it's been there since the guitar was made in the early 1970s. And it now plays like an absolute dream. And so I was really pleased about that. So then I contacted Graham's first wife, Margaret, and told her that I had the guitar. I wanted to see if she had a little bit more info on it, on the background of where Graham bought the guitar, because typical blokes, he and I just talked about music, guitars, and cars, and I'll come on to that in just a minute. But anyway, Margaret said, I think that guitar is his favourite. I think that's the one that he took with him to New Zealand. And so then I tracked down Graham's second wife, Ray, and she said, yes, that's the guitar. That was Graham's favourite guitar. It was the one that was in New Zealand. She'd sold it to a former student of Graham's on the promise that he would look after it and cherish it always. And sadly, he'd ceased playing, and the guitar, for most of the last decade, had just sat in a cupboard, neglected, and gone to rack and ruin, to be honest. But here is the guitar. This is the very instrument. Graham's old Martin D35S, and it is absolutely fantastic. And of all the guitars that I've ever owned in my life, this is the one that's never going anywhere. My son Sam will end up with this guitar one day. It's staying in this family. As I said, the other thing that both he and I had a passion for was Fiat sports cars, and in particular the 124 coupe. He had a very fast yellow 124 BC coupe that he called Bert. Graham was passionate about his cars, and he was a maniac driver. And again, apart from jamming and talking about music and playing music, the other thing that we did, which probably could have cost our lives on many an occasion, was driving very, very fast and recklessly. Now, when I wanted one of these cars, because it was also one of my favourite cars, it was actually Graham that found my Fiat 124 for me. Mine was faster because it was red. Stranger than truth, not long before this guitar came up for sale, my son Sam and I had found another Fiat 124 in a barn up on the Sunshine Coast, where it had been for 28 years untouched, and we bought it between us, and we'll be in the process of restoring it. I had to find a song that suited, and so I found a song by one of the people we used to listen to, Steve Tilston. It's called Along the Road When I Was Young. And if ever there was a song that fit Graham Marrow perfectly, it's this song, because it talks about a life in music, and it even mentions going along the road hell for leather, which is the way that Graham drove. So I hope you enjoy it. signs and diversions when searching for the sun. Many mislaid plans and missing persons along the road when I was young. Down that well-worn path I wandered, chasing dreams in the blue yonder and freely spending time. 'Twas mine to squander along the road when I was young. Many nights alone, some nights together with one special one. Then back behind the wheel and held for leather along the road when I was young. My first song, it did linger. Oh, how those notes spill from my fingers, and I did stand in line with those folk singers along the road when I was young. Ooh, along the road when I was young. There were no goodbyes for some companions. I never realized when time was done that each with our own absolute opinions along the road when I was young. I had guitar, was free to travel, strands of life did unravel, and then I sold my soul to the crossroads devil along the road when I was young. Down that well-worn path I wandered, chasing dreams in the blue yonder and freely spending time. 'Twas mine to squander along the road when I was young. Ooh, along the road when I was young. Along the road when I was young.